Good evening, everyone. I'm Domina Schmiller, and I'm the host of the Facebook group Preserving the History of Newberrytown, and I'm delighted to be filling in for Karen, the manager at the Redland Community Library, and she is away traveling today. Welcome to the third and final spring Zoom into History talk. Zoom into History is a collaboration of the Redland Library, AllVets of York, and the Northeastern York County History and Preservation, commonly known as NEYCHiP. While both the library and NEYCHiP organizers plan successful in-person programs, both realize that with the precarious needs to keep individuals safe at this time, we can work together to present quality virtual programming. Please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen if you wish to ask questions to the attendees, because everyone's going to be muted throughout the presentation. At the end, we'll share your questions and comments, and we'll talk to the presenter, and we're going to open it up for question and answer. Charlie?
All right, tonight we have Joseph Cress, a award-winning journalist for the Central newspaper in Carlisle. He's going to share stories of vets, which he profiled in 3 of his books. One of them is called World War II Memories, the Great Crusade in Europe. The other is World War II Memories, Pearl in the Pacific. And the third one that is be coming out very shortly here is World War II Memories, Sentimental Journey. The Great Crusade is a collection of memories from 8 veterans who served in the European during the Allied march to France and the lower countries into the heart of Nazi Germany. Pearl in the Pacific is a collection of memories from eyewitnesses of World War II in the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor through the defeat of Japan. We are looking forward to hearing the firsthand stories of these veterans. So let's welcome Joseph.
Thank you. First slide, please. Good evening. Thank you all for tuning in. Can you all hear me pretty good?
Yeah, you sound great.
Life is a journey down many paths that define who we are. Generations ago, men and women from across the United States answered the call to serve at a critical time when the country needed them most. World War II became their journey, their path to an adventure of a lifetime. For many, it was their first time away from home, yet they braved the uncertainty. They left behind the familiar to step out into the unknown with mixed emotions of fear, excitement, and hope. The war took them to exotic, far-flung places where they learned to live life to the fullest, knowing death was always with them. Combat tested and transformed them. Struggle pulled and tugged at them until they were not quite the same again. Every witness to World War II carries around experiences as emotional baggage. Each perspective unique, they build upon the collective narrative of a war that delved into every ocean and reached into every corner of the globe. Tonight, you will meet 8 World War II veterans. You will see their faces. You will hear their stories, and hopefully you will remember them. Next slide, please. Since Memorial Day is next Monday, I want to briefly touch on our current situation using statistics from the National World War II Museum. In 1945, there were 16 million World War II veterans living stateside or on occupation duty overseas. As of September 30th, 2020, there are only 325,674 World War II veterans left in the entire country, including 18,614 in Pennsylvania. Currently, these veterans are dying at a rate of just under 300 per day. That pace will no doubt accelerate. It is projected that by the end of this year, there'll be about 250,000 survivors. That's the loss of about 75,000 men and women, the equivalent of about 5 World War II US Army infantry divisions. The number of survivors will fall below 100,000 in 2024. Just 3 years from now. The last of them will leave us by the 2030s. One of those veterans who passed away was my grandfather, who served in the Army. Next slide, please. Two family members inspired me to write this series on World War II memories. This photo was taken in June 1945 at Camp Landing, Florida, where my grandfather, Paul John Cress, the big god leaning on the vehicle, served stateside as a mechanic. The little guy standing on the bumper is my dad, Paul Robert Cress. A Navy veteran, my dad worked for over 30 years as a certified nursing assistant at the VA Medical Center in Lebanon, my hometown. Upon retiring, Paul Robert Cress was the volunteer coordinator who managed the fleet of shuttle vans that transported veterans from outlying counties to Lebanon for treatment and appointments. One day, my dad shared a memory with me from his time as a CNA. He told me of a common practice up in the wards where staff members cared for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. When they knew a veteran was about to die, they would keep a vigil over the person. They would hold the person's hand to reassure the dying that he or she was not alone in the room. Knowing my dad was involved in this inspired me to collect the memories of World War II veterans. Unfortunately, my grandfather passed away before I launched this initiative, so I never had the chance to collect his war stories. My dad is still around. He's in his early 80s. Next slide, please. We begin with December 7th, 1941, the date that will live in infamy. As a journalist, I've interviewed hundreds of people over the course of my 30-year career. There are only a few that I would consider famous. Joseph Lockard stands out because he appears in the history books as an ordinary Army private caught up in extraordinary events. I actually had the honor of talking to him twice. The first time I interviewed Mr. Lockard was in late November 1991, just prior to the 50th anniversary of the raid on Pearl Harbor. He was a retired engineer who lived outside Harrisburg. I was working at the Sun newspaper in Hemmelstown. The second interview was in December 2006, while I was working for the Sentinel in Carlisle. I'm now going to read an excerpt from the Sentinel story that I included in my book, World War II Memories, Peril in the Pacific. The raid showed up as one enormous blip on the electric horizon at 7:02 a.m., a very broad pulse on the primitive early warning radar. Private Joseph Lockard was amazed to see the contact rapidly approach from 132 miles out, coming ever close to Oahu and its military bases. I checked the equipment. It all seemed to be working correctly. I had to assume there was something out there, he recalled. I knew by the speed they were planes. They marched right at us. Technology saw the formation of aircraft as a single object bearing down on his position atop a volcanic ridge. Lockard tracked the echo as George Elliott worked the plot table, trying to predict course and speed on what should have been an uneventful Sunday morning. Elliott reported the contact, but was told not to worry by a young lieutenant, Kermit Tyler, on duty at the Signal Corps Information Center. It was now about 7:08 a.m., December 7th, 1941. The question Lockard still asks himself today is, what would have happened if the Japanese had launched their strike on Pearl Harbor just an hour earlier, when all 6 mobile radar units were turned on, sweeping the horizon around the island during a training exercise, which concluded at 7 a.m. History is strange and loaded with coincidence. On that long ago morning, Lockard figured Elliott was new and could use some extra training. So why not continue to run the radar post at Opana Point? Besides, the truck assigned to return them to base was running late that day of infamy. Only 19 at the time, Lockard never expected to be a footnote in the history books. Hindsight is always 20/20, Lockard says. With the time we had, about the only thing we could have done was move some planes and man the guns on the ships. Nothing could have stopped the inevitable ruin. 20 miles out, the blip was lost in the clutter of the signal reflected off the land. The first bombs fell at 7:55 a.m. Next slide, please. The first 6 months of World War II in the Pacific were the darkest and most desperate days for the US and our allies. The Empire of Japan dominated this theater of operation, conquering Wake Island, Guam, Malaysia, the East Indies, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. The US Navy blunted the advance with the Battle of Coral Sea and turned the tide of the war with the Battle of Midway. In August 1942, the US launched an amphibious assault on Guadalcanal, the first in a series of island hopping operations that gradually carried our forces across the ocean. This brings us to George Mixel, an orphan turned jungle fighter with the Bushmasters in New Guinea. I will now read an excerpt from the story, Strike One, Strike Two, also from Peril in the Pacific. In spring 1944, near Wakta, New Guinea, George Mixel was assigned the task of helping another soldier load crates of ammunition onto a Jeep for transport back to the front line. They arrived at the supply dump around 2 p.m. A short time later, an artillery shell exploded in the jungle, the equivalent of several city blocks away. I heard the whoosh of the shell and saw a puff of smoke, Mixel recalled. When a second shell landed about a block away, Mixel realized an enemy artillery piece miles up the coast was zeroing in on his position. They were probably watching the area with binoculars, he said. They knew they knew we were there. They knew we were after something important. They wanted to destroy it. They were not after me or the other man. We just happened to be there at the time. Mixel gave a warning, only to end up alone in the line of fire. I had turned my back to pick up a crate. When I turned around, I was surprised to see him drive down the dirt road away from the beach. I understood. He was only trying to protect the ammunition. Maybe he expected me to jump into the back of the Jeep. He was about 100 yards away when the third shell hit. Training kicked in as Mixel jumped behind a thick tree root, propped himself off the ground on his hands and toes, arched his back, and shouted at the top of his lungs. This odd exercise was his only chance to avoid being injured by the waves of concussion that washed over him and through the ground following the explosion. Keeping his belly off the ground prevented his stomach and lungs from being ruptured by the blast pressure, while shouting relieved the strain on his eardrums by equalizing the force. It only partially helped. While his abdomen was spared trauma, his ears were not. In the decades that followed, Mixel suffered from a persistent, high-pitched ring. Though the tree root protected him from shrapnel, Mixel was still in danger. The last shell hit the supply dump and set the remaining crates on fire. Bullets exploded as the heat cooked off the ammunition, sending fragments of metal flying through the air like a hive of angry bees. Mixel had to run through all that to escape. With no ride, he walked 7 miles back to the front line, wondering the whole time if a Japanese sniper would take a pot shot at him. Instead, Mixel spotted 3 enemy soldiers approaching the headquarters bunker. I saw them only yards away, sneaking through the jungle growth. I stopped dead in my tracks. One spotted me and fired. The bullet came so close to my head, I could hear the whistle only inches away, he remembered. Other Americans saw the Japanese and managed to kill them all. Excuse me. But one GI took a bullet to the chest near a major artery around the heart. With every beat, blood spurted out of the wound. Medics took the man away on a stretcher, but Mixel never heard whether the soldier survived. George Mixel was honorably discharged from the Army on June 24th, 1945. He returned to central Pennsylvania, where he worked for the New Cumberland Army Depot and retired as a storekeeper after 34 years. When Mixel died on March 4th, 2019, he was survived by a son, a daughter-in-law, 3 grandsons, and 2 great-grandchildren. Next slide, please. As US forces advanced across the Pacific, the Western Allies defeated Germany in North Africa before conquering Sicily. That campaign served as the launch point for an assault on Italy and the opportunity to open up a second front on the European continent. Since June 1941, the Germans had been fighting a brutal war on the Eastern Front against Red Army forces. One goal of Italy, and later the invasion of France, was to draw German forces away to the south and west in order to speed a Russian advance and the eventual demise of the Third Reich. We turn our attention to Robert Otto and his first experience with combat in the skies over Northwest France. Early in the morning of June 6, 1944, this year marks the 77th anniversary of Operation Overlord, the combined airborne and amphibious assault on Normandy. A Carlisle native, Otto was a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne Division. I will now read an excerpt from the story, A Strange Air of Beauty, from the book World War II Memories, The Great Crusade in Europe. Peering through the clouds, Robert R. Otto could see the invasion fleet as dark shapes plowing through the English Channel. Every soldier on the transport plane was eager to get the night jump into France over with. There was almost complete silence, but no noticeable tension among the men. Most of them slept, while the others just sat and waited, deep in thought. The formation of aircraft approached the drop zone by an inland route from the east, only to be spotted by the enemy. It seemed the whole German army had just opened fire, Otto recalled. The anti-aircraft had a strange air of beauty about it. Tracer rounds streaked the ebony sky, peppered here and there by flak bursts. Fragments of red-hot metal hit the fuselage, bursting through in a couple places. The plane shuddered from the explosions. When the red light came on, Otto stood up to ready himself for the jump. Not knowing what to expect on landing, he chambered around in his M1 carbine and switched on the safety as the plane came in low over the horizon. He was the second man out the door when the green light came on. The jump had to be made from 400 feet or less, Otto recalled. His parachute swayed back and forth, once, twice, a third time before he hit the ground. He landed hard in the pasture, but was not injured. Cows were out grazing in the moonlight, a sure sign the field had not been mined or booby-trapped. I landed by myself in a field surrounded by 15-foot-high hedgerows, Otto said. It must have taken me a half an hour to get my chute off. At least it seemed that long. I tugged at the straps for a couple of minutes and then peered through the darkness to see if anyone was watching me. The place was alive with Germans, and one could almost be beside you on the other side of a hedgerow. I pulled out the parachute again, trying to get it unbuckled. In desperation, I cut the thing off with my knife. For a period of time, Otto lay sprawled in a ditch along a hedgerow to take in his surroundings and figure out his location based on a map he had in his possession. It looked as though he had missed the target by at least 3 miles, so he had to do some walking in hostile territory. I was tripping my way through the woods in the darkness, stumbling all over the place, Otto recalled. When I heard a challenge barked out, I thought it was the end. It was so dark. I was against the bayonet before I knew that it was another one of our men. As we met up with other fellows, it was like a whole new company. I never found any of the fellows from my own plane. Later that day, Otto was severely wounded when a German artillery shell exploded nearby. At one point, Otto was thought dead, but woke up long enough to see a Catholic priest administer last rites. D-Day was his only combat jump. Next slide, please. By mid-December 1944, the Western Allies had broken out of Normandy and had raced across France into the Low Countries and the western frontier of Germany. Adolf Hitler had a choice. He could commit a strategic reserve to the Eastern Front to slow the Red Army advance, or take a gamble and launch a winter offensive in the West to split the Western Allies in the hope that it could bring them to the peace table. Hitler rolled the dice in what later became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land battle of the war for the US Army. We turn our attention to John Otto, older brother of Robert Otto, and a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division. John had more experience with combat jumps in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. He was wounded in action during Operation Market Garden, a combined airborne and land assault in Holland to seize bridges over the Rhine River. John Otto returned to duty in time to participate in the Battle of the Bulge. I will now read an excerpt from the story Triple Insurance that appears in my latest book, World War II Memories, Sentimental Journeys, due out this June. Shaping the plastic explosive numbed his fingers and sapped the warmth from his hands. John Otto had to work quickly and quietly under the cover of night to set the charges to cut the support beams of the metal bridge. He was worried he would freeze to the same structure he was ordered to destroy. His feet were soaking wet as his legs dangled down from beneath the span and dipped into the icy waters of a stream caught in the grip of winter. The day before, the battalion commander had ordered Otto to finish the job started by the 307th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the 82nd Airborne Division. Specialists from that unit succeeded only in blowing off the wooden deck, leaving the bridge supports intact for the enemy to use. All the Germans had to do was lay new timber over the 9 I-beams, or stringers, that spanned the gap between the 2 concrete platforms jutting out from either shore. That first night, John Otto sneaked up to the edge of the woods to closely examine the bridge from the cover of the trees. He had to estimate the amount of explosive needed for the job. The bridge was in this wide valley over a stream, and on the other side was a very large hill, he recalled. There was a road somewhere behind the hill, and I could hear the German trucks, tracked vehicles, and motorcycles moving down the road. We knew they were there. Maybe they didn't know where we were. The next evening, Otto returned to the bridge with 2 men carrying 6 satchel charges of plastic explosive. Each man had to plant 2 charges on 3 stringers to cut the metal at different lengths to weaken the bridge. The stream had swelled since the night before, so they couldn't sit on the beams without getting their feet wet. To plant a charge, they first had to remove the explosive from the satchel and take it out of its wrapper. They then had to mold it into shape using body heat to compact it. Otto figured they had lost 25 to 30% of the explosive because parts of it crumbled and fell away from their fingertips. The men wired each charge with 3 fuses as triple insurance. Everything was brought to a centralized location where Otto rigged the plunger to trigger the explosion. He included something extra to cover their escape. When the plunger was pushed, a white phosphorus grenade flew into the air and exploded, followed by a second grenade closer to the ground. The 2 grenades left behind a dense cloud of smoke, enabling them to leave without incident. We froze our asses off, but we got the job done, Otto said. John Otto returned to the US in 1946 and stayed in the active duty Army a total of 23 years before retiring in 1961 as a lieutenant colonel. He then worked another 33 years with the federal government as a civilian intelligence gathering specialist for the Department of Defense. He retired from government service in 1994 and died on January 13th, 2016 in Butler, Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. From the start, the Pacific Ocean saw the extensive use of aircraft carriers as a main offensive naval weapon of the US and Japan. One of the men I interviewed was Robert Hensch, a retired auto mechanic who lived in Carlisle. During World War II, he was a crewman on board the USS Bataan, a light aircraft carrier assigned to Task Force 58, the main strike force of the US Pacific Fleet during the closing stages of the war. Mr. Hensch was a gold mine of primary source material. Not only did I have the notes from the interview, I had access to his war diary, his cruise book, a long letter that he wrote to his brother, and copies of the ship newspaper. With all the doom and gloom of today's headlines, I thought it would be refreshing to interject a bit of World War II humor. The poem I'm about to read was from the Christmas edition of the 5-Star Final, the ship newspaper of the USS Bataan. It's a sailor's spin on a recognizable holiday classic. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and out on the sea, not a creature was stirring but the battling bee. The stockings were hung by the side of the stack, and each little sailor slept snug in his sack, while visions of Greybills, Lamores, and Lamars danced to the dreams of her innocent tars. The ship was all silent and quiet at our post, stood we of the watch like somnolent ghosts. The moon on the crest of the soft rolling sea painted patterns of silver in the foam's filigree. And I stood there alone with the wind moaning low, and I thought of the Christmases we once used to know, of the fragrance of fir and the crackling log, of the snow and the sod and the scent of the nog, of laughter and carols and gifts 'neath the tree, of mother and dad and of Mary and me. For my thoughts, like all sailors when revelries roam, on the feet of my fancy flew straight away home. So I dreamed and I nodded, then awoke in a flash as I heard out to starboard a sizable splash. And there in the path of the moon's silver sheen, I spied, on my honor, a pink submarine. 'Twas trimmed all in tinsel and lit up with lights, and it glowed and it glittered, the strangest of sights. Hitched up to the bow were 6 purple whales, who drew it along with flips of their tails. And along the port side, in red and in green, a sign Merry Christmas was easily seen. And there on the deck, all smiling and slick, was a fat, funny figure of good old Saint Nick. Ship ahoy, came the cry, ringing over the tide as he whipped up his wells and came alongside. Ship ahoy, he repeated, stand and hove to, 'cause I'm in from the pole with cargo for you. So I stopped all the engines, called side boys and band, and waved him aboard with a welcoming hand. And he came up the ladder, saluted and cried, Merry Christmas to all, and a happy Yuletide. Now wake up the captain and pipe up the crew, and we'll pitch us a party with no more ado. Then he laughed and he chuckled, and off of his back, he plunked down the hugest gigantic old sack, and he opened it up with a magical rhyme. 'Twas clear that his gnomes had worked overtime. There were gifts for us all, a present for each, and the sack never emptied. We had only to reach. There was candy and fruitcake and puddings of plum, and barrels of beer and whiskey and rum. There was caviar, chicken, champagne, and cigars, and sea books galore for Cadillac cars. There were blondes and brunettes and redheads to boot, and each was a glamorous, lovable beaut. Then last but not least, from out of Santa's sleeve, came papers all signed for 30 days leave. So we ate till we popped and drank till we floated, till all of our tummies were pleasantly bloated. We sang and we laughed and we danced with the girls, till our heads went around in gay giddy whirls. The scuppers all ran with overflowing gin, and the night was alive with a jovial din. 'Twas a night to remember, a night to retain, for it's like I am sure might not come again. But alas, with the first rosy hint of the dawn, Santa chuckled and winked, and lo, he was gone. And gone were the girls in the pink submarine, and there they had been, there was not to be seen, but the blue of the sky and the red rising sun, and the white of our wake in the course we had run. Now don't laugh and say this tale isn't true, because I swear it all happened as I told it to you. Don't cynically claim it can't happen, it could, and surely to good little sailors, it should. Next slide, please. Near the end of the Pacific War, the Japanese used suicide planes to crash into US Navy ships. Carriers were a prime target of what became known as the kamikaze, or divine wind. I will now read an excerpt from my chapter on Robert Hensch from the book World War II Memories, Peril in the Pacific. Too scared to even think, Robert Hensch could only watch in horror as the suicide pilot took aim at the flight deck of the USS Bataan. Hensch knew once the enemy began his death dive, there was little chance for the pilot to miss unless the anti-aircraft barrage knocked the kamikaze out of the sky. It was April 17th, 1945, and the Judy dive bomber had started its attack with a bomb that missed an escort. The pilot pressed on towards the Bataan, skimming the ocean just above the wave tops as he drew closer to where Hensch stood on the port side catwalk. It was so close to us, I never heard it, but I saw it come in. 5 seconds and it was over, he said. A common tactic of kamikaze pilots was to try and hit one ship with a bomb and then crash dive on another. That way they could damage 2 vessels. Another tactic was to approach at very low altitude. Anti-aircraft guns can only bear so low, Hensch explained. If it's too low to the horizon, you risk hitting a friendly ship. You are not supposed to fire that low, but in the excitement and confusion, the gunner got carried away and kept on firing as he tracked the target down. Hensch watched as the plane made a loop to pull up for a steep dive on the flight deck. But just as it was about to hit, the Bataan dodged out of the way. The skipper put the ship in a hard turn. That's why it missed us, Hensch said. One advantage we had was the Bataan was built on a cruiser hull. Speed and maneuverability counted in a kamikaze attack. We were very fortunate that day. Hensch wrote of the close call in his war diary. He, the enemy pilot, just missed my GQ station landing signal platform by about 15 feet, and boy was I scared. When he hit, there was an explosion and pieces of plane going in all directions. I saw the wheel flying up in the air past me about 30 to 40 feet. Hensch could also see the pilot's body from the waist up bob out of the cockpit. Near as he could figure, the flight harness must have severed the man cleanly in half upon impact, ejecting the head, arms, and upper torso as the plane blew up. What remained of the pilot sank to a watery grave with the rest of the dive bomber. It was frightening to watch the kamikaze come over the task force in waves. The anti-aircraft was so heavy, the sky was just black, Hensch recalled. There was so much fire, it covered the whole task force in smoke. You were a sitting duck, especially the carriers. That was their main target. To put a ship out of commission, kamikaze pilots aim for the central elevator on a carrier, the base of the bridge on larger ships, and any place between the bridge and midship of a smaller warship or transport. Sometimes friendly fire from excited gunners proved just as lethal. The same day, the dive bomber narrowly missed the Bataan. A 5-inch shell from a nearby destroyer struck the carrier, killing one man and wounding another. Next slide, please. Elsewhere in the Pacific, U.S. forces continued a strategy where certain islands were invaded, while others were bypassed, isolated, and starved out. As we edged closer to the Japanese home islands, the enemy became even more fanatical in their level of resistance. On February 19, 1945, U.S. forces invaded Iwo Jima. The plan was to use the island as an air base for fighter planes to escort B-29 bombers raiding Japanese cities. It was thought that Iwo could also serve as an emergency landing field for crippled aircraft. The Japanese took advantage of the natural terrain to maximize their defenses. The result was a bloodbath, while total US casualties exceeded Japanese casualties for the first time in the war. We turn our attention to Howard Kozier, a Marine wounded on Iwo Jima. While on Iwo Jima, Howard Kozier survived 2 near misses in one day by enemy artillery. He had just returned to Yellow Beach 2 after working a few days as a forward observer with the 25th Marine Regiment. It wasn't a job I normally did, Kozier recalled. I filled in when necessary. When I came back to the beach, there were 4 to 5 radios for me to fix. He was just getting ready to make the repairs when a large artillery shell exploded nearby. It must have hit really close. The next thing I knew, I was rolled onto a stretcher. I was dizzy and couldn't hear anything. Tears were flowing down my face. Litter bearers took Kozier to a large shell crater on Yellow Beach 1 that served as a battalion aid station. There they stacked him with other stretcher cases on the crater floor, while other Marines sat along the wall. A second shell exploded on the crater's edge, burying the wounded in layers of volcanic sand. The seated Marines suffocated before they could be rescued. Kozier owed his life to a Navy corpsman and a fellow Marine who pulled him out head first. He was then taken to a transport ship anchored offshore that served as a floating hospital. Kozier had temporarily lost the ability to speak, and there was shrapnel in his back and one leg. Within 3 days, he could hear again and was well enough on the path of recovery to be anxious to return to his unit. I just couldn't sit out there while my friends were catching hell, he recalled. Yet every time he asked permission to rejoin the fight, a doctor told Kozier, not yet, maybe tomorrow. He gave me the same line every day. It got to the point where I realized I had to do something. Kozier bided his time for just the right opportunity, which came as an announcement over the PA system that any wounded man returning to duty should report to the starboard side weather deck at 8 a.m. He went down to the brig where the crew had stowed all the helmets and weapons recovered from wounded Marines. There, Kozier outfitted himself with equipment before heading for the weather deck. He then waited in line while someone barked out names. They called the name Ostrowski, but there was no answer, Kozier said. They called it out again. At that point, he posed as Ostrowski and was ordered to climb over the side of the transport ship and into the landing craft waiting below. A German by descent, Kozier pretended to be Polish for several more hours until he could rejoin his old unit. It would be years before he realized the concussion from the second blast had left him permanently disabled. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, in Europe, the US Army Air Force was engaged in a strategic air offensive against targets throughout Hitler's Third Reich. Constant Maffei, seen here in the second row, the first row, and the second from the left, served as a flight engineer on B-24 Liberator bombers flying out of Italy. I will now read you excerpts from the story, Was It Us? From World War II Memories, Sentimental Journeys. Constant Maffei could tell if a man was a B-24 pilot just by looking at his left arm. It was twice as large as the right arm because extra strength was needed to hold the wheel in place as the pilot worked the throttle controls with his right hand. At 23,000 feet, the pilot would fly for 10 minutes, and then the co-pilot would fly for 10 minutes, Maffei said. I used to be between them, wiping the sweat off their brows from flying that aircraft. They had to hold it in formation and not run into the guy in front of us. Accidents and near fatal close calls were inevitable in the confusion of battle. The flak would push your plane all around, Maffei said. One time he was in an aircraft that had strayed underneath another B-24 that had just opened its bomb bay doors. Fortunately, the top turret gunner spotted the hazard and came over the intercom, yelling to the pilot, Sir, the planes are going to drop their bombs directly on top of us. The pilot adjusted course just in time to avert disaster. Once over Vienna, we got knocked out of formation and dropped 20,000 feet, Maffei recalled. The left inboard engine was knocked out by flak. Another 88 millimeter shell exploded near our wing and turned us almost upside down. We went down sideways. I was up against the ceiling. The pilot and co-pilot were working like hell, trying to pull it back and get it out of the slide. As they started to pull out, I was down on the floor. At about 5,000 feet, we pulled out of that, but we still had our bombs. Our bomb bay doors were open. I got between the pilot and co-pilot, and the pilot said, dump the bombs. I hit the toggle switch. By the time the bomber had crossed the Alps and reached the Adriatic Sea, Maffei knew it lacked the fuel to reach Italy. So he recommended an emergency landing on the island of Vis off the coast of Yugoslavia. Originally a Royal Air Force fighter base, it was little more than a runway with one or two hangars. Thank God we didn't have any of our hydraulic systems shut out, Maffei said. We had to brake to stop at the end of the runway because there was a mountain. There was scattered wreckage from planes that had hit the rock face and exploded with their crews. Being the flight engineer, I went with the plane and the mechanics they had there to get the engines running, Maffei said. We stayed overnight and just slept in the plane. They filled us with enough fuel to get back to base. But they were in for a surprise when they landed around 2 p.m. The guys from the day before reported they saw us getting hit out of formation, Maffei said. They never saw any parachutes. They marked us down as killed in action. They went to our tent and packed all our personal belongings to get ready to ship to our families. We had to put up our tent again. We had to get our stuff back. They thought we had all died, that we had crashed. Word came over the radio that during a raid on Vienna, an American bomber got knocked out of the sky and had accidentally dropped its bombs on the wrong target, killing 160 civilians. 38 years later, we had our first squadron reunion, Maffei said. We saw each other and started crying. The first thing our nose gunner wanted to know was whether we had killed those 160 people. It had haunted him for 38 years. I don't know whether it was us. I had no idea where we toggled the bombs, just it was not over water. We had to unload those 8 500-pound bombs. In the immediate post-war years, Constant Maffei worked in the family locksmith shop. He married his wife, Afra, on February 9th, 1947, and together they had 5 sons and 3 daughters. 3 sons became military officers, while 2 daughters married officers. I'm the only enlisted man, Maffei joked during the interview for this book. During his career, he mastered the profession and started his own specialty locksmithing enterprise. Maffei was almost 98 when he died on January 5th, 2021. Aside from his wife and children, he was survived by 33 grandchildren and 48 great-grandchildren. Next slide, please. We finish up with William Wayne Tritt, who during the war served as a sergeant assigned to a machine gun squad with the 272nd Infantry Regiment, 69th Infantry Division. On Easter Sunday, 1945, Tritt enjoyed an impromptu holiday meal along the Rhine River, where his squad kept vigil for anything suspicious floating downstream. But days later, Tritt was not at all cool or collected. I will now read an excerpt from the story Panic Attack, which is from the book World War II Memories, The Great Crusade in Europe. Something snapped inside William Wayne Tritt that terrible day he walked into Kessel, Germany, and left his unit behind. Panic came over him on seeing the dead GI, compelling him to throw away his pistol and rush down a street choked with debris. Having walked 26 miles, Tritt and his men were exhausted when they entered the city outskirts and witnessed the devastation. When I got into Kessel, I saw real damage for the first time, Tritt recalled. I had seen many houses bombed out and burned, but Kessel was a large city, and according to statistics, 95% of it was bombed to destruction. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't have some livable space in their basements, perhaps where the debris formed little cavities where they could survive, but it was such a massive destruction. I just couldn't believe my eyes. Walking down the street, he encountered a different kind of horror. We came upon an American tank that had been hit, Tritt said. The turret had been sheared off at the turret line, probably by the impact of an 88mm shell. Nearby was the upper half of an American soldier, his torso sliced cleanly at the belt line. There was no blood, just raw meat with a purplish tint around the edge of the wound. The corpse had a bandolier strapped along the shoulder and across the chest, with 2 to 3 grenades tied to the straps. I never even saw his face, Tritt recalled. The rest of him, I didn't know where the other half was. The lower torso and legs were probably still in the tank. The man must have been standing up inside the turret when the shell hit the vehicle. Seeing the mangled body triggered a primal fear. At that point, I just panicked, Tritt recalled. I was a squad leader, and I just abandoned my squad, essentially. I don't remember where they were, but I started running. Where was I headed? I was headed east. Eventually, his men caught up with Tritt as he sat down to compose himself. They were relieved he had not been hurt. Tritt had not encountered a single German the whole time he was in a panic. The 69th Infantry Division has the distinction of being the first American unit to link up with Red Army forces during the closing weeks of the war in Europe. The first book in the series, World War II Memories, The Great Crusade in Europe, includes this funny memory of the post-war occupation. The burly Red Army soldier knew he had to be properly medicated before treatment could begin. William Wayne Tritt was in the dentist tent, waiting for an appointment the day the Russian came in, holding his jaw. The man was roughly 5 foot 10 inches tall and weighed about 200 pounds. When he removed his hand, you could see the cheek was swollen, Tritt said. He appeared to be in a lot of pain. The dental technician gestured to an examination chair before grabbing a pair of pliers. He was walking towards the Russian, intent on pulling out the bum tooth, when the big man waved his hands back and forth, crying out, "Niet, niet, vodka, vodka." Clearly, the man wanted a dose of what passed for a painkiller in the Red Army. Though it took a while to fill that particular prescription, the Russian downed the half bottle of vodka in no time. He put it up and drank every bit of it, Tritt recalled. That would have knocked me out right there. Instead, the big man just relaxed and lowered his guard enough for the technician to pull the tooth before asking the patient to rinse and spit some blood into the bowl. It was funny to watch that, Tritt said, but I wouldn't have laughed in front of the Russian. They were so unpredictable. You never knew what they were going to do. From what Tritt saw, Red Army soldiers were not just tough and hardy, but a loud and boisterous bunch, all too eager to party. The war was over. It was a time of rejoicing. It was natural for the survivors to celebrate at every opportunity the end of 4 years of fighting with Nazi Germany. They claimed over 24 million lives in the Soviet Union. They even invited Americans to join in on the fun, though Tritt never got involved. I saw them from a distance. Others were in the thick of it. Next slide, please. This concludes my presentation. Do you have any questions?
It looks like we actually have a question already in the chat from Pat Topper. It says, I was told by a Pacific World War II vet that our GIs could use the Japanese ammunition, but they couldn't use ours. Could ammo in Europe be used by either side?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I've never heard about that before. I honestly don't know. I don't know if the ammunition was interchangeable between the two sides. So I really can't answer that.
Okay, so I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm going to ask you guys to unmute yourselves. If you have a question, you can raise your hand or you can type it in the chat. Just let us know. I'm unmuting you guys now.
By the way, did all of that come in pretty clear?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? You can either type it in the chat or you can unmute, raise your hand, just go ahead and ask.
And as you can see, the book is available in local stores like the Reader's Cafe in Hanover and the York Emporium in York. I didn't catch that. What was that?
Sounded like someone was trying to say something. Did you want to repeat yourself if you were the one asking the question?
Yeah, I didn't catch any of that.
Are your books online that you can purchase?
Not these books. Prior to these books, I published 5 books with what's called the History Press. If you look up my name, Joseph D. Cress, or Joseph David Cress, and the History Press published 5 of my books, which are available through the History Press or Arcadia Publishing website. Now, 2 of the stores that you see on that list.
I hate this.
What? 2 of the stores on that list, the History on High, the shop, and Whistle Stop Bookshop, can send books to you. You can order them online and they can ship the books to you. Are you there?
Are any of these books in the York Library system?
I'm pretty sure the first 2 books are The Great Crusade and the World War II Memories, Peril in the Pacific, are in the Dillsburg Library, but I'm not sure how far beyond that they go.
Are there any more questions?
Tommy, I see a 1 on the chat there. Is that the question we already heard, or is there a new one in there?
Yeah, no, I already asked that question for
Okay.
Pat.
Good.
Yeah, if anyone else has any questions, you can unmute yourselves and ask away.
How many different stories are in your books?
Let's see. The current one I know, the one I'm doing now, that's going to be coming out in June, has about 90 stories. The other 2, I can actually tell you. I'll be back in a minute. I have to get something, but I can tell you how many stories are in each. Okay, hold on a second.
Tommy, it looks like another one went into chat. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, it says was Robert Lockard from Harrisburg. Jim, are you asking if Robert Lockard was from Harrisburg then?
Was he actually from the Harrisburg area?
Okay, I'll ask him as soon as he comes back.
Yeah, I'm having trouble. I lost connection here for about a minute.
Oh, I apologize.
Well, I think it's on my end.
Okay.
Our
Okay.
internet isn't
Are you
too
there?
good.
Yeah. Hey, Joseph, was Robert Lockard actually from the Harrisburg area? One of our viewers lost connection for a minute.
Yes, he was. He was from, I don't know if it wasn't from the city. He was from one of the townships surrounding the city. I can't recall
Okay.
which one exactly, but he was from the Harrisburg area. He actually used to be an engineer with AMP.
Oh, okay.
And he retired out of AMP, and then he, like I said, how I first came across him was I interviewed him for the Sun when I was with the Sun in Hummelstown. So, and then I interviewed him again when I was with the Sentinel. So it's like, to answer the previous question, World War II Memories, The Great Crusade in Europe has 65 stories. While World War II Memories, Peril in the Pacific has about, where's that? I have to look at my introduction here. 65 stories. So both the first 2 books have 65 stories each. And then the third book that's coming out in June has 90 stories.
Were these all people that you personally interviewed?
The first 2 books were involved with people that I exclusively interviewed. Yes. The third book has a new section called Other Memories. And what I did there was I drew some firsthand accounts from newspapers. So not all the people in that particular section I interviewed. But the first 2 books, everyone I interviewed at one point.
Were these all people from this area?
Yes. Mostly Cumberland County, because I work in Cumberland County. So a lot of times prior to COVID, since COVID, I've been working from home. But prior to COVID, most of my time was spent either traveling to, coming away from, or working in Cumberland County. So a lot of the guys I interviewed was from Cumberland County because it just worked out logistically.
Now, I was told that on the plane that dropped the atomic bomb, it had someone from the Harrisburg area on the plane. Do you know about that?
No, I don't. I never knew about that. The newest book that I'm working on right now, the fourth book, which would be the fourth book in the series, which probably won't be ready until next year, actually had there was a science professor at Messiah College who actually was part of the Manhattan Project. And I have a little write-up on him in that one because, you know, obviously that factored heavily into the Pacific War. So it's like and then I also had some in the newest book that I'm working on, the one that hasn't there's the book that's coming out in June, and then there's another book that was a Pacific book that's going to be coming out next year. That also has some eyewitnesses to what Hiroshima looked like after the blast. So those are things that I'm going to be putting in the fourth book when it comes out next year.
I had a neighbor that was actually on D-Day going to the beaches. And when he got there, he was trained to be a rifleman. But when he actually got on the beach, he was converted to be a medic.
Oh, really?
On the spot.
Oh, wow. Okay. Did he survive? Well, yes, he obviously survived.
Yeah, he just died a few years ago here.
Okay. Do you know what beach? Was it Utah or Omaha?
No, I do not know.
Okay. It's probably Omaha. Omaha was the worst of the two beaches for us.
On AllVets and on my website as well, NEYCHiP website, I have some stories of local people as well that I knew about.
I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the people that I profiled in my books are no longer with us. But I can tell you, like, one of the people on the World War II Memories Peril in the Pacific, he had an actually interesting story. He was a teenage boy who was living in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded, and he became a civilian intern. So he was put in these internment camps, both at Santo Tomas and Los Banos. So his experience was that of a civilian under the Japanese rule in the Philippines. So that's more of an interesting, you know, that's a different perspective. He's still with us. He's still alive. There's maybe like one or two others that are still living at this point that I've interviewed. Other questions or comments?
I've been watching a TV series online. There's like 36 half-an-hour excerpts of World War II, and it's been very interesting, the different battles and so forth.
Do you know what it's called?
I guess I'm looking up. I can send you the information, but I think it's called Battle Conflicts, I believe, and I can get you that information. But you know, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating spending time with these guys. I mean, I spent hours with them, trying to basically pry out as many memories as they could remember. And it's like anything. Some of them had a lot of memories. Some of them had a lot of vivid memories, but others, you know, it's like, it was just harder to recall. I mean, by the time I got to them, it was like, decades after the experience. So it's like, it's just, it really depends on the person. Like I can tell you, like with the fourth and final book that I'm working on now, one of the people that's going to be in that book is, he was a crypto analyst for the Navy. He was stationed in what's called Cavite, which was the naval base near Manila. And when the Japanese came in and invaded the Philippines, he was captured on Corregidor. And he actually was a prisoner of war for, under Japan for 3 years. He managed to survive. And for about 2 to 3 weeks, he was on board what's called a hell ship. And a hell ship was prison ships that the Japanese ran between their outlying islands to the Japanese home islands. And he survived being locked away, if you can imagine this, in a compartment, a cargo compartment on a freighter with hardly any food, hardly any water, no ventilation, no air conditioning, nothing like that. And he was jammed in this space with hundreds of other guys. And he somehow managed to survive that insanity. And he was saying that, there was probably murders that took place in that particular compartment because the conditions were driving people slowly mad and insane. And he ended up working, this particular veteran, who'll be profiled in the fourth book, ended up being a slave laborer in Japan. So he actually heard Emperor Hirohito come over the radio and announce the surrender of Japan. Though he didn't really understand Japanese, but he saw how the Japanese around him reacted to the news. So suddenly these Japanese people became very dejected and very quiet, and they kind of blended into the background because they were, they just surrendered, which is something Japan never did before. So he actually was there when the emperor announced the surrender, which was kind of neat. Any other comments? Or I see there's other questions on chat, but I'm not sure if any of those were questions.
Everything on chat has been read. It says, thank you, gotta go, great stories. Thank you for sharing great information.
So you guys, really, anything else?
I just had a quick comment, not really a question.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm not a sailor or anything like that. I don't know, I guess I was just a tourist. I just wanted to remind people, if you live in central Pennsylvania, go out and see Battleship New Jersey. Because it really is being preserved in fantastic condition, all things considered. And they need as many people to tour it as possible. They run a fantastic YouTube channel, the curator does. And when you go on board the ship, you're greeted by the curator. And they just do a fantastic job. And of all the battleships, though, they're all still around the 4 BBs. It gets the least amount of visitors. So it'd be great if everybody could go check that out at least once.
Where exactly is it?
So it's in Camden, New Jersey. Basically, you just drive to Philly, and there it is. Yeah, it's super easy to get to. Super easy to get to. The parking's not bad. You basically almost drive up to the ship.
Wow.
And there it sits in the harbor. It's been preserved in its 1980s configuration. There's only one part of it that's in it's World War II setup, but most of it is in its 80s configuration. They didn't want to mess with it at all. As they received it is how they preserved it. And,
okay.
Fantastic tour. The only thing that I would say is if you're not in any kind of shape, it's kind of tough because if you've never been on a ship like that, it's a lot of climbing up and down.
Yeah, I can relate to that because back in 2000, I went to England. I spent most of my time in London. And I don't know if any of you ever heard of the HMS Belfast, but the HMS Belfast is a British Royal Navy cruiser that's at anchor in the River Thames. And you can get on board this thing and you can crawl around it. You can go to different sections of the ship. And, I'm not exactly trim and slim. So it was kind of interesting maneuvering around with my backpack, going up and down things. And it's like trying to get, because it's like, that was the only World War II era ship that I actually was on. I said, well, that's not true. I was on the Intrepid at one point. But the Intrepid was used after the war too.
This is super fascinating. As far as projects, they really need people to get on the ship and check it out, right? Because they're in the middle of replacing the deck, and the deck was a $3 million job. And so another point in this decade, they need to get into dry dock, and that's not exactly going to be cheap either. And I know $20 from the 4 people listening or whoever isn't going to make a whole lot of difference, but every little bit helps. And if I can't get there to volunteer to get on it, then it'd just be cool if somebody could pass it on. Hey, New Jersey's not that far away.
Now,
Yeah, I didn't realize it was that close. I mean, I didn't realize it.
It's not far at all. It took us. So we live in Edders, and it took us like 2 hours, 20 minutes to get there.
Okay.
Yep. And for veterans, I think was it free there? No, $20. It was like no more than $20.
That's pretty reasonable. I mean,
it's extremely reasonable for what you're going to see and what you're going to get.
So did you actually go into the gun turrets too, or were you just?
Yep. You can get into the gun turrets. The turrets, they can't preserve all the spaces on the ship because it's huge. So like, they preserved one gun turret to perfect condition. One that's got 4 engine rooms. One of them has been restored to perfect condition, so you can see what it looks like. And there's another guy that actually gives you like a little specific tour of the engine room when you get there. Just kind of like whenever a group congregates, he kind of takes you down there. It's a little tricky to get down to, so they're kind of watch you a little bit down there, I guess. There's some stairs that are kind of tricky. So, but yeah, a lot of it has just been restored to like amazing condition. There's all kind of little neat things that you would never realize that are on it. Like its little silver set, which you can see in the Harrisburg Museum. It's on the ship in the like the Admiral's quarters or whatever. Just really, really neat stuff.
My father served on the sister ship during the Korean War, so I took him down there to New Jersey. Oh, he just loved it.
Fantastic.
He knew more than the tour guides. In fact, the people were asking my father questions. And he took me to places that they didn't normally go on the ship. He showed me where he slept. He showed me where he worked. He was fascinated with that.
Was this before the current tour guide? Because I think he's like a historian as well. The guy knows like every nut and bolt. It's incredible.
This was a couple years ago that they just had volunteers as tour guides.
Well, which sister? What did he serve on? Which one?
The bigger one, the first one.
Well, there's the Missouri, the Iowa, and there was
the Missouri.
The Missouri.
Yeah.
That's what I want to do someday if I can do it. Is I would love to go to Pearl Harbor, and I would love to see the Arizona Memorial, and I would love to see the Missouri. To kind of like, because that kind of like brackets the 2 ends of the war there, and I'd just love to see that.
They're not identical at either. Imagine that. Believe it or not, they're not all identical. They all are just slightly different. They were all at different times, and so they're all just a hair different here and there. Some of them have little different armor. It's a little thicker here and there, but otherwise they're pretty much the same. In New Jersey, it's just right here. So I was going to say one last thing about it, and I can't remember what it was now. I hate getting old.
Yeah.
Damn it. Damn. But they'll let you do other cool stuff, like every so often they'll let you fire the salute cannon.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a saluting gun there, and of course they do little things to raise extra money, and so for a couple extra dollars you can fire the saluting cannon, and then because the deck's getting tore up, You can buy a chunk of the deck, like however big you want. I mean, if you want like a 2x4 size, or you want just a little piece, whatever, you can buy a piece of the deck. So, but I highly suggest that their YouTube channel. It really is incredible. Every kind of quirky, weird question that you could ever want to know about it, they've pretty much covered it. You ask a question in the comments, and they'll answer it, and they'll do like 10 minutes, 20 minutes on your question. It doesn't matter how quirky it is. Just don't ask them if they're ever going to reactivate the ships again, because they've only heard that about 500 million times.
Well, what was neat about that guy Hensch that I don't know if you were online when were you online with that one?
Yes.
What was neat about him was a lot of that stuff, a lot of those newspapers that he had, he got to know somebody that was on the current USS Bataan, the amphibious assault ship. And that person actually took his like old ship newspapers, and they're in the archive of the current USS Bataan. So that part of the history, the old ship newspapers from the World War II era Bataan, as far as I know, they're still around.
Yeah,
that guy was, but Mr. Hensch was incredibly neat. I mean, he had just all these things. I mean, it's a very thorough war diary. I mean, the chapter is very extensive, and it covers like it doesn't cover every entry, but I used a lot of that material because it was so incredible neat. It was neat to talk to him and have his material there. And like I have another person that I'm profiling for the final book, and he was on board the USS Salt Lake City, which was basically a heavy cruiser. And I had access to his war diary as well. And what was interesting about his war diary, where Mr. Hensch would have an entry for like a day, right? This guy had time signatures for during the day. So he must have had his war diary right there on his battle station with him, jotting down notes as it was happening. So he actually had like, that 0500 this happened, that 0600 this happened. It's like he had it down to the minute sometimes.
Wow.
And it's like he had to have it with him, which is, I don't think he was supposed to do. I don't think you were supposed to have a war diary when you were on battle stations in general quarters. But he had it right there. He must have had, in order for him to get that detailed.
Wow. That's super neat. Yeah, that's all I got. I'm done. I don't want to hog the mic.
Okay. Nice meeting you or
Yep.
hearing you.
Yeah, thanks, sir.
We have a comment from Jim. It says, "Thank you so much for recording these stories so they are not lost."
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to ask now. Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up. So thank you, Joseph, for an informative and enlightening program. These programs are recorded and will be available on the York County Library's YouTube page and on NEYCHiP's website, so you can rewatch them. Thank you, everyone, for participating with us this evening. We appreciate your comments and your questions. Be sure to stop by the Redland Library to see the displays of World War II memorabilia during the month of May. And I have to say, I helped bring in the person that donated the World War II memorabilia, and it's an amazing display. So please, if you have the chance, go to the library and check that out.
Yeah, you should take some pictures of those so we can, put them on the website.
Yes, I believe Karen, who is traveling this week, has pictures, so I will let her know, and she will put them on the library Facebook page, and we'll give them to you, Charlie.
Okay. And now, during the month of June, my group, Northeastern York County History and Preservation, we're going to have a scavenger hunt through the area of northeastern Pennsylvania. We have for $10, you can go around and take pictures of all kinds of different things that I have listed up there: soldiers and veterans, outhouses, you name it, you get points. So it's $10 register, and we're going to give out prizes at the end of the month. And then during July, we're going to have posted some of the pictures that people took, and you can vote on the best pictures and get prizes that way as well. So we're trying to preserve the history of the area. So if you're interested, go to NEYCHiP website to register. So, and I want to thank everyone here for participating. And okay, for the final slide then, we're coming up in the fall. Scott Mingus is going to come. He's going to talk about the Civil War in York County. And Greg Hafers, he's going to talk about York Police and Fire Rescue. And then again, Joe's going to come back again and talk about the crimes in York County. These will be live at the library, as well as they're going to be Zoomed and they're going to be recorded. So that's what's happening for the rest of this year. And then next year, we're going to have more events, historical events, and try to preserve the history of the area. So I want to thank everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay connected to the library. Night, Joseph. Night, Charlie. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you
Thanks.
all.
Thank you, everybody. It was fantastic.
Yep.
Take
Good
care,
night.
guys.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.